Madison, Wisconsin, the capital city of Ultimate.
There's no doubt the crowd and energy and that momentum is contagious when you're on the road, right?
We have a little bit of an experience here, and we've taken care of this team a couple of times in the past.
Skying through the contact for the score.
Like it was nothing.
He was off.
Oh my gosh!
That's a Callahan by Andrew Mechanic to tie the game.
Goodness, are you kidding me?
This would be a gigantic moment for Madison.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass Week 4 recap action coming at you. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We've got 11 games to get to, and so let's not dilly-dally around at all. Salt Lake getting their second 2-0 road trip of the season, improving to 5-0 with two big wins in Oakland and then Colorado this last weekend. DC and Philly taking us to the first double overtime sudden death finish of the 2024 season with the home team Breeze pulling out the thrilling victory in front of their fans. Philly having one of their most impressive performances in their franchise's history. James Pollard going for 10 scores, damn near 1,000 yards, and couldn't pull off the upset against the team that they want to make a rivalry out of more than anything else. But the Breeze persevere once again against the Hotbirds. New York also getting back on track after they dropped a game in Atlanta in week 2. They were off in week 3, but in week 4, they had two big road matchups starting in Friday in Boston, facing off against their former captain and league MVP, Jeff Babbitt, as well as former All-Star and All-Defense member Ben Katz. Both Katz and Babbitt won 3 championships with New York, but they could not get the win with Boston as the Empire prevailed 17-15 on Friday and then 18-16 on Saturday in Montreal. Empire now 3-1 on the season, and would you look at that? Sitting atop the East Division standings once again in a virtual tie with DC. The two superpowers out there once again summiting the ranks after it felt like there was some topsy-turvy results in the first 3 weekends of play. But once again, New York and DC sitting on top of those standings. Pittsburgh coming up with the absolute surprise of the weekend, getting a huge 16-15 win in Minnesota over the reigning divisional champs. Wind chill. There were 53 combined turnovers in that game, Cam. Absolute rock fight, slot fest, Big Ten football matchup, but the Thunderbirds coming up with just enough to get their first win against Minnesota since 2019 and also their first win of the 2024 season. Meanwhile, Minnesota falls to 2-1 and now faces a very trepidous Madison road trip game this Friday in the return of the Super Series, free on YouTube, by the way. There were also other results in the league. San Diego, Atlanta, Madison, Houston, and LA all getting wins. I know you didn't get the result you wanted against the Hustle. I know it was a little bit of a frustrating night on Saturday for you. But overall, what were your takes on the week 4 slate of action, Cam?
This is the best weekend of Ultimate we've had so far, I think, in terms of...
Yeah,
like this season, in terms of games that mattered, results that were shocking, entertainment value, I mean, I thought you had kind of a little bit of all of that. You know, we had a really good tight game with New York and Boston, a game we've been kind of anticipating. We had the Colorado Salt Lake game, which I know I was really looking forward to. I think you as well. Like, what was that matchup going to look like this year? And we felt so good about Colorado going into it, only for Salt Lake to come and just smack them in the face. And then we have a Philly team who kind of looked like, you know, nothing to write home about this year. They scored more goals in this game than they did their first 2 combined. And, you know, put up a fight that I don't think any of us were really ready for against the DC team that looked like it was finding its footing and was going to maybe kind of cement its hold on the division. And now after that performance, you know, I'm sure you're like me. DC not quite looking as dominant maybe as we thought that they might in the division. Like, this was a game, I think, after how they got to Philly in the first game when they were on the road, I think we probably both expected this to be a pretty lopsided victory. And Philly showed some fight. So I thought that there was a lot of interest. And then, of course, the Pittsburgh result, like, not going to lie, us in Indianapolis, I found out about that as soon as our game was over. And I thought somebody was pranking me. I was like, yeah, good one, bro. Like, Pittsburgh does not win in Minnesota. It just does not happen. They always go up there and get shellacked. So the fact that somebody told me they won, I didn't even believe that the game was going to be close. So a lot to get to, a lot of interesting results, and just so many highlight play. You could almost make the top 10 this week just plays from the Breeze Philly game alone.
Yeah, I mean, there were buzzer beaters in 3 of the 5 quarters that were played. Well, there was technically 6. I don't know if the last one, given that it was a walk-off and sudden death, qualifies as a buzzer beater, but that would actually push it to 4 at least.
Yeah.
James had 2. I think Triflis had 2. He had a block and a score.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there were plays at the end of every quarter in that game. Yeah, to your point. That was just a highlight fest. The most exciting game of the season, DC and Philly. We'll get to that in a minute. I wanted to start with Salt Lake's road trip through Oakland and Colorado.
Yeah.
Salt Lake now moving to 5-0 on the year. They're the first team to 5 wins this season. I think them and Carolina look head and shoulders above the competition through the first 4 weeks of the UFA season. And to that point, these were 2 decisive victories for the Shred. I mean, they were running on their opponents at the end of these games. The 6-goal margin in Oakland actually camouflages the more accurate, I feel like, 9-goal deficit that the Spiders were facing at home before they rattled off a few late breaks to make it a little bit trimmer. But Salt Lake was running away for that one for most of it. And then against Colorado, like these teams normally do, there's going to be some trading early, but that second half was completely owned by the Shred. It didn't even feel like Colorado, for getting to within 3 goals at one point in the fourth quarter, which shout out to the color analyst Chuck Kindred for pointing it out at one point in the broadcast. How is Colorado still in this game at this point, given how they're playing and given how the Shred are playing? But Shred closed that out, get a 5-goal win in Colorado. The last time they played in Colorado, they got a single goal win. In 2022, they didn't get any wins in Colorado. It just continues to show that this Salt Lake team, to me, continues to be on this upward trajectory of improvement that just kind of defies how evolutions are supposed to happen in this league or in sports in general. I mean, you know, just to draw a comparison, kind of like what happened in one of the game 7s yesterday in the NBA, Minnesota, you know, kind of leapfrogging the former champs, sort of leveling up in a way, but they've experienced playoff setbacks. They've sort of had to take their lumps over the past several seasons. This Shred team, they're in their 3rd season. All they've done is just sort of take a lump, take a setback, and then the next time they have an opportunity to improve and show themselves again, they do so definitively. And man, both these wins, I have such a hard time discerning whether the Shred are the best team right now or the Flyers, because Salt Lake keeps just dispatching of everything in front of them. I know sometimes we like to malign the competition in the West, some of the more loose strategies and play styles, but Salt Lake is 5-0. They've got wins against Colorado and DC right now. They're running down the mountain at teams. It feels like they have set up their season for the matchups in New York at the end of June in that Super Series matchup. What was your take on the Shred this weekend? Like, where do you kind of want to start analyzing what appears to be the championship favorites?
They're the best team in the league. I know we've talked about Carolina, but I think one thing we need to take into account also, not just that they're 5-0, but 4 of those wins are on the road. And those both coming in doubleheader weekends where and this weekend was so insane. They went into Colorado, right? They have to go into altitude on the second day of a back-to-back, and they looked like the team that had more energy. As I think Chuck Kindred, you brought him up earlier, I think he was the one who pointed out, Colorado looks tired. They look like the team who played a game the day before.
They were gassed. They were gassed in that fourth quarter.
They had, Alex Atkins is like one of those guys that just like wears his emotions on his sleeve, right? Like they have several guys like that in Colorado. I think Syed Simran's another guy who I feel kind of does that. And I mean, you could just see it in their body language. You could see it in their faces. Like they were not having fun. They did not look like they wanted to be there. I mean, they were clearly getting worked by Salt Lake, and Salt Lake to go in there and just take control of that game and just be a dominant team after playing the day before and having to deal with all the travel. I mean, that game was set up for Colorado to win. I mean, you couldn't ask for much of a better situation. While Salt Lake did get a big lead against Oakland, like Oakland wasn't a team that they could have just gone in and kind of like lollygagged around. Like they could have found themselves in a precarious situation. They go in there and take care of business, and then they come to Colorado and take care of business again. And I think maybe one of the things that worked out actually really well for Salt Lake and maybe kind of hurt Colorado is, Colorado's one game into their season. Salt Lake already had 4 under their belt, and they'd been battle tested. They'd played a DC team who we expect to be, one of the better teams in this league. And Colorado had a home game against Seattle on the back day on the second day of a back-to-back. They haven't been battle tested yet. I think we felt that in Indy this week in a similar situation where Atlanta had played 3 games, 2 against Carolina and 1 against New York, and we played a game against Detroit. Like we have definitely not been battle tested, and then New York or Atlanta comes in and kind of, we hang around for a little bit, and then they kind of smack us in the face, and we weren't ready to respond to that. So I think Colorado may have suffered from a little bit of the same thing there. Like they haven't had the ability to ramp up into a game like this, where Salt Lake started off right off the bat with one of their toughest games they were going to have all season, and they weathered that, showed they were the best team there, and they've just continued to show that every game since then. I mean, to have 5 wins and still have 5 home games left in their schedule, pretty nuts.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to speak for them because I think it's going to be such a get-back game for them. I think it's kind of their own regular season championship against New York. But all of a sudden, Salt Lake has set themselves up to essentially have that be a passer game. Like if they lose to the Empire, that doesn't really, I think, affect their ability to close out in the West or sort of set themselves up for a deep playoff run. And had you asked that coming into the season, I think that would have been absurd. It would have been absolutely, they've got to go into that New York game and treat it like it's a playoff game for them. And yet they can now kind of stomach an interdivisional loss, which is not something that many teams can afford in this league. I'm sure I could get a lot of thoughts from you about that after this past weekend.
Yeah.
But just kind of talking a little bit about, we'll get into players, I think, in a minute, because I want to touch on what Jordan Kerr and Jacob Miller are doing on the offense, as well as the pressure and just the tenacity of that Shred D line. But to get into some team statistics, on the weekend, Salt Lake had 32 total turnovers. They had, in the 2 games, they had 18 total blocks, 18 total breaks, above 60% offensive conversion rate in both games, which is kind of like the elite level is to convert above 60%. They're now 5th overall in the league in 2024 in offensive conversion, 4th overall in hold percentage. But the thing that really leaped up this week, and it was mentioned on both broadcasts as a focal point for the Shred coaching staff led by Bryce Merrill, as well as the players, red zone efficiency. Mm-hmm. That has been the bread and butter of this offensive attack in their first 3 seasons. They didn't do so well in their first 3 games. They never converted above 78%. This past weekend, they were a combined 89%. They went 23 of 25 in the red zone against Oklahoma. 25 red zone opportunities. They scored 25 total points. 23 of them came within 20 yards. It shows the kind of discipline this Shred team has to just work it into scoring position and then run it down your throat. It like Salt Lake's ability to construct these kind of volume and efficiency numbers around their red zone opportunities reminds me of an NFL team with a really strong ground game. But you just can't dispossess a team from kind of establishing good drives, getting gainers, kind of getting into third and short situations, so to speak, which is what I feel like this Shred team does so well. You watch how they finish drives, and it's just little plinko passes between each other. There's no real fuss. If anything, like their sort of ambitious shots are Elijah Jaime running away from people. And it's just there's no strain, and I think one of the things that I've seen with the new Frisbee, the second year of these new defensive rules and pulling rules and all of that stuff, most offenses, including you guys in 2 indoor games, have some strain to them, and there's just none with the Shred. They seem to be able to work out of any sticky situation. Colorado has a ton of athletes, and it just felt like they were basically dispossessed, especially in the last 3 quarters, from making any kind of pressure plays on Salt Lake's offense.
Yeah, we talked, and you know what? I feel like we had the same conversation in the preseason when we were talking about the top offenses in the league and talking about Salt Lake last year, right? When they get in that rhythm and they're just like hitting open person, open person, open person. It's just like they're so hard to stop because they have so much team speed that like once they get going, it's like they're like a freight train that's running away. Like how do you stop it? I think what teams need to start doing is try to get creative with how to kind of start them right off of the pole. And teams have not been able to really do that. No team has been able to kind of stump them immediately off of the pole. And until a team finds a way to do that, which the only 2 teams we really saw do that last year were Minnesota and New York, they're going to continue to just run away on offense over and over and over again. You would think with the new disc and the way it flies and how deep you can get poles and, moving up the polling line last year, that should lend itself to teams being able to stop these initiation plays and to really stop them at the point of attack. But teams out west haven't figured out how to do that yet, apparently, because nothing seems to be working in slowing down that offense. The only team who actually kind of did it, weirdly enough, was San Diego. Not the team out of their 5 games that you would probably point to and be like, oh, I bet that's the team that like gives them the struggles and that in their initiations and in their flow. But maybe other teams need to look at what San Diego did because it was effective. It did keep the score really low scoring. They were able to force several kind of out of character turns for Salt Lake. But they looked very unbothered this week. And like you mentioned, they went 35 of 39 in the red zone this weekend. That is insane. Yeah. So I don't know, like to me, this is the best team in the league right now. It's hard to say that Carolina deserves to be called the best when they've played only 2 games against the same opponent. And they were at both games at home with Atlanta missing like crucial pieces in both games. It seems like not that Carolina wasn't missing people too. I get that, but until I see Carolina do something as impressive as what I just saw from Salt Lake, I think we gotta say Salt Lake is the king of the jungle right now, and until proven otherwise.
So you mentioned the 3 defenses that have been effective in slowing down the Shred attack in recent matchups. The 2 teams at championship weekend last year in Minnesota and New York. And then San Diego this year, which held Salt Lake, I believe, to 18 goals in their week 2 win.
Sounds right. I think it was 19 to 17, maybe, something like that.
Yeah, it was a 2-goal margin. It was beneath 20 goals, which I think is an absolute success against the Shred team that can just
100%.
unload on you if you aren't careful and disciplined. One of the characteristics I think all 3 of those teams in Minnesota, New York, and San Diego share is their ability to rely more on team defense and structure rather than just simply winning one-on-one matchups, which is one of my critiques about the defense that is played in the West Division. There's a lot of just kind of, hey, our guy's going to beat your guy.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to go out into space and we're going to test you. That's kind of how a lot of West strategy falls out, especially on the defensive side of the disc. And Salt Lake has just figured it out, man. They're too strong and too connected of a unit, and they're going to find your weak point, and then they're just going to pick it apart over and over and over again. And you could just sort of feel that against Colorado. It wasn't necessarily that Summit lacked good defenders or that they weren't able to make plays on a disc in space, but just Salt Lake didn't allow them any opportunities to do that stuff. There was just no fat to trim on the shots that they took. I mean, you look at the huck attempts that they were kind of engaging in. They were 10 of 16 on the game, 63%, which is good, not excellent, but good. And especially at that volume, they're just going to be engaging in a lot of explosives against Colorado and kind of putting them on their heels. But I think a lot of the missed opportunities were on the defensive side, where they were just being overly aggressive and kind of punishing Colorado for any turnovers. On the offensive side, they're only looking to throw out into space. They're only looking to throw out to an Elijah Jaime, a Jordan Kerr, a Ben Field, a Jay Studnabile, running away from the defender. Otherwise, they're just going to hit open hands underneath until they, get within red zone and then just crush you. And it's just, the simplicity of it all is so appealing. The color analyst from Oakland, Matt Ruby, was just kind of gushing at the end of the Oakland broadcast about just watching this Salt Lake offense sort of operate, because there's just no loose screws. There's no unoiled gears. It's all just one machine working towards exactly what each of them knows how to do in every spot on the field. And to that point, maybe here's how we kind of bridge into, holy crap, man, the season that Jacob Miller is having in addition to Jordan Kerr, I mean, they're basically playing mistake-free ultimate, and it's making this team, again, look like the absolute championship contender that they've been building towards now for 2+ seasons. I mean, Jacob Miller has 206 completions and 2 throwaways. He's on pace for one of the most, at least top 3 most efficient volume and efficiency throwing seasons ever, if not maybe on track for the best. And he's complemented by Kerr, who's completing almost 98% of his throws, just makes everything look easy. He's not necessarily making a ton of highlights, but there's no strain. Again, there's no tension in anything this offense is doing yet. And it feels like they're just beginning to tap into that.
This team is still so young.
Yeah.
It is. It's like, when you look at the teams in the league historically, like, I'm not even talking about going way back, even like recent history, there's usually this smattering of like, yeah, there's some young guys, but there's a lot of veterans, guys who are maybe in their upper 20s, early 30s. Like this New York team that's been so good for years, right? Like, you look at the core.
Carolina too.
Yeah, Carolina's the same way. Atlanta's the same way. Like, so many of these teams that have been like thought of as, top teams in the league, it's a lot of a smattering of like all over the place. Now they have Grant Lindsley, who's my age, basically a senior citizen.
He wasn't active.
Basically,
he wasn't there for them.
Yeah, and he wasn't, but but he is a guy who obviously plays a lot of points for them, and we've kind of seen him on both sides of the disc this year so far. But when you look at most of their roster, I mean, we're talking about a lot of players under the age of 25, like 25 and under. And it's really impressive what they're doing. I mean, it's probably one of the reasons they're able to do what they do, right? Like, they are younger. They've got fresher bodies. They've got that speed that, can diminish as you get older, especially if you aren't doing what you need to physically prepare yourself. But that's the thing. Like, everything I hear out of that team, it's not just that they have the youth and the speed, but like that they're working. Like, they're in the weight room. They're doing these practices in the off season consistently. Like, they're together as much as they possibly can be when it does, outside of just games and like regular scheduled practices. And when you get a group of guys that are that young and that full of energy and that willing to commit that amount of time and effort to getting better, and they're doing that together all the time, I mean, that is not a luxury that every team has, and that's not a reality that a lot of the teams face, or a lot of teams are living. So, like, they're doing a great job out there. Bryce Merrill is leading this charge. Like, he's done a great job of leading these young, energetic kids. I call them kids because they're more than a decade. I mean, most of them were in diapers when I graduated high school. And I mean, it's incredible to watch. Like, it's one of those things that, like, I mean, if you can keep these guys together, like, we could potentially be looking like New York is clearly not the same New York we've been seeing. We might be seeing the new New York, like the team that could be here at the top for year after year after year. And that's pretty scary. Like, if you're out west right now, like, just looking at them and seeing like those guys aren't aging out anytime soon, that's scary.
I don't think you're incorrect. I do think that you bringing up New York, though, is a little bit of a warning sign to me because, to your point, New York has kind of come tumbling down the mountain a bit, and we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, they're still 3-1. They just look drastically different from the pinnacle and sort of unperturbed champs that we left them at last year. And so I'll always be quick to remind anyone who follows sports that like these windows, and you know it too, close so rapidly.
They do.
Like, we can be talking about this week. In 4 more weeks, somebody makes a defensive adjustment that makes the whole kind of house of cards collapse, and suddenly it's a new ball game. I mean, this is what happened last year with Colorado too. They were 5-0. They were the reigning division champions. It looked like they were going to kind of barnstorm their way to their second straight West Division championship, and that's not what happened at all. And now we're talking about Salt Lake like they're the new kings of the block. And I always want to temper some of that stuff because it's so easy to project. They're so young. It'll just continue to improve astronomically over time, or but that's not what always happens in reality. But to your point, I think that Salt Lake has the core capable of reaching those kind of heights. And also, to kind of dovetail off your point, I think that what Salt Lake does so well as an entire offensive unit is amplify strengths while concealing weaknesses. You never see the person who shouldn't necessarily be taking the throw out of position doing that. You don't see Jace Dunabile throwing from the back line ever. He's throwing continuation hucks, or he's redistributing and cycling back upfield as a receiver. Same with Jordan Kerr. He basically takes one left rail open huck look a game, and if it's not there, he's working it back into the system. There's just such a humility and understanding of their roles that I think doesn't really have a peer right now. That, to your point, I think that if that keeps building, yeah, we could see a New York core like that. I wanted to flip it over to the other side of this because as impressive as the offense was in its consistency and its ability to perform and its precision and its passes, the fire of this team, for this Shred team right now, is coming from its D-line. I mean, they're wearing teams out there. And there's something to be said about a little bit of the physicality that they're introducing, especially on the marks, which I've heard from a variety of teams are getting to be a little too intense. But aside from that, their ability to just track and hunt and pursue in space, lay out on everything close, challenge you, make you want to play in sort of a heightened, we need to take the shot now atmosphere. I mean, they kind of let Colorado burn themselves out. 4 different Summit players finished with 3 or more throwaways. Noah Kuhlman and Alex Atkins are phenomenal players in this league. Absolute stars. Kuhlman made 2 plays against the Shred that, the spearing block and then assist to get a dirty hold at the beginning of the first, and then that skying, flying, layout, whatever you want to call it, play he had at the buzzer off of the Atkins 95-yard bomb. I mean, those are just plays that like no other, I don't think 2 other players in this league make. And yet they combined for 11 throwaways in this game. They had 1,200 total yards of offense, but they had 11 turnovers.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of becoming a little bit of the emblem for the Summit team where, yeah, you can look at some of the counting stats and some of the highlights and it's great, but against these good teams, they seem to have trouble in their composure and discipline of just maintaining, of getting a simple hold and not going for the big play.
Yeah. Before the season, you and I both were talking about how great Alex Atkins can be. And, this is a guy we talked about being potentially like a sleeper, like MVP candidate. He had 8 turnovers in this game.
He had 8. Sorry, he had a drop too.
Yeah. He had 8 turnovers. And that's just inexcusable. I mean, he would tell you the same thing himself. Like, I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't openly admit. And it just felt like the moment was too big. Like, I'm not saying necessarily for just those 2 players. It kind of felt like it was too big for the whole team. But watching that game, I saw just so much players trying to do things all by themselves. Players, yes. You talked about Salt Lake being so selfless and humble. I almost felt like I saw the inverse of that with Colorado this weekend, where every person that touched the disc, it almost looked like they needed to be the one that made the play. One thing our coach in Indy, Coach Shepard, says is, we don't need you. If you think you have to do X thing in this game for us to win, you're wrong. We can do it without you. And I think that's maybe a message they need to hear in Colorado, because it really did feel like sometimes players were just like, no, I need to do this for us to win. And that's just not going to work against a team like Salt Lake that's so good across the board. You mentioned how their D-line really kind of set the tone. I want to give a shout out to Ben Ashton, who I think has been playing incredibly well this year. He's already got as many blocks this season as he did all of last year. He's been the guy who's a lot of times picking the disc off a turn, which isn't necessarily where he's always been in the past. Particularly, I think he's like negative receiving yards right now, which is so weird considering what I feel like I saw from him in the past, where he'd be streaking downfield after a turn and looking to be, the person getting hucked to.
He's more of a thrower for them this year.
Yeah.
He's really matured in that role.
He has. And as you mentioned, even though he's put in that role, it doesn't feel like he's ever trying to force anything. He's been put in that role to kind of just get the disc moving. And you brought up in the last episode, I believe, how much more efficient they've been offensively. And they've just been really, really solid with taking care of the disc with their D-line when they get the disc. And he's a big part of that.
Still challenge. I mean, they had that huck from Joe Merrill to Johnny Hoffman on the layout that was big exclamation point. Tony Mwanga is, I think, maybe one of the most underrated defenders in this league. He can cover backfield. He can cover downfield. He's big. He likes taking big matchups. They've got Chad Jorgensen, who's been on an all-defensive team and is still just maybe one of the top 30 athletes in this entire league as far as being able to go out and make a play. I mean, they're just loaded. Simon Dastrup was shouldering out Saeed Semrin in space. And I spent the preview pod, the last episode we had, kind of describing how much of an X factor it felt like Semrin added to the Colorado offense. Dastrup completely took him out of his game. It's just and for the third straight season, they can just sort of rotate in 10 dudes on that D-line, and they all know to do that. They had to basically replace their entire starting defense from 2022 to 2023. Didn't knock them off at all. They lose Joel Clutton over the offseason, who has been sort of I don't know how to call it other than Hulk of their defensive lineup. When they needed a play, they knew they could look to Clutton to go be the big man to do it. And he's not on there anymore. Doesn't matter. They've got this line. Kyle Weinberg, a guy who also made an all defensive team, a guy who has been one of the most solid defenders in this league since 2022. He just doesn't get out of position much. There's times in which he gets scored on, but then he just comes back out the next point and runs another disciplined set of coverage. And it's just like that 1 through 7 on their entire defense. Credit to Bryce Merrill and this coaching staff, man. They've got everyone tuned up exactly how they should.
That's why they're the best team in the league right now. They
are. But let's move on. We've spent enough time talking about Salt Lake. We've spent a ton of time talking about Salt Lake, honestly. We need to get to the most exciting game, DC and Philly. Man, that went 6 quarters. It didn't really relent throughout. Philly came out absolutely on fire. They only had 1 turnover through the first 3.5 quarters of this game.
Yep.
They finished with 12. And we'll get to how that number inflated, particularly at the game, as we discuss this. But honestly, hats off to Philly a little bit, right?
Yeah.
They get absolutely trounced at home in both their first 2 games of the season against DC and Boston. And now they face a Breeze team on the road. This is a team they haven't beaten since 2017. It's something that Philly has been trying to build into a rivalry. They've been very close over the past couple of seasons, but they've never quite gotten over the hump. Philly just came out firing, man. And I mentioned it at the top of this episode. It's been covered on the website. Evan Lepler wrote about it. Everyone's aware of it. James Pollard went absolutely beast mode in this. I mean, we always knew that he's big game James. He showed this in the first half of the playoff game in 2022 in DC. tapered in the second half, had a few throwaways that were pretty crucial. But in this game, he just kept coming at them. And when you see this Philly team hit its stride and become the hot birds for a second, it really does impress upon you what their ceiling can become. But I want to get to this because their team stats are just a little remarkable. They were 11 of 11 on Hucks. This is a team that has lived by the Huck, died by the Huck the past couple of seasons. They were 4 of 5 on breaks. Not a ton of opportunities, but 80% conversion rate on your defensive looks, especially against an offense like DC. Very respectable. Mm-hmm. They had a 63% offensive line conversion. They had 12 turnovers, but 1 block. There's always some part of this Philly team that just gives way in games like this. They can have perfect performances from so many other places, and then they get 1 takeaway. Like, that's just not going to work on the road against DC. And to that point, DC's offense, 75% offensive efficiency, 25 red zone opportunities on which they converted 21. Very Salt Lake. You're getting a lot of easy scores. It's essentially getting buckets in the paint. Like, you're just manufacturing good efficiency numbers for your offense where you're getting in the red zone that often. And in comparisons of Philly's 1 block, DC gets 7. And a handful of those coming at the end of the game. I think most notably on Isaac Lee's diving end zone block late in the 4th that set up a goal line break score opportunity for the Breeze defense. But it's another heartbreaker for Philly. It's another kind of relief win for this DC team. Elliot Bonet connects with Tyler Monroe on the game winner in double OT. A very suitable connection for that game, given how amazing both Bonet and Monroe are. And I don't use that word lightly. I think in a game like this, it's very easy to lose your head and maybe adopt what we were just kind of talking about, a Colorado mindset of like, I'm going to go out and hit this big shot. I'm going to go out and make this big throw. And it just felt like DC kept playing within themselves, trusting we're going to get back. And they just kept edging from their deficit throughout the game and eventually got the 1-goal win. What was your big takeaway from this game other than James being a freak, DC still being really good, and the East still being absolutely chalky?
Oh gosh, where do I want to start? So yeah, James Pollard was nuts in this game. It really makes you question the coaching staff's decision to not have him starting on the O-line to start the season. Like, he was starting, he played a lot of defensive points in that first game against DC. Thought that was a little strange. We see what he can do, putting over on off. And here's the thing, he completed 95% of his passes. Like, that's kind of been that's been the weak spot for Pollard in his career, right? It's been the completion percentage. It's been the taking.
He had 46 completions.
Yeah.
Which is also like double what he normally gets in a high-end game for him. He's usually 15 to 20 touches a lot of times.
Yeah.
He had 50 plus in this game.
He's usually 15 to 20 touches with a couple turnovers. And instead, he has 2 throwaways, as you mentioned, on 48 throws. He completes 95% of his passes. The hucks that he was taking, first off, the hucks look much improved from him. He's always had the power, but like the precision that he put on his throws, especially his flick, just like every throw was perfectly placed where it needed to be. And like that seems to be an area he's really improved in. I was really impressed with him. But here's the thing. They got an all-timer from James Pollard. They got an all-timer as a team hucking. And all of that was just enough for them to lose by 1. It is staggering, the team stats you mentioned that exist in this game, that they didn't just outright win. It kind of speaks, I think, to some of the problems they're having this year, right? They got blown out in their first 2 games. It took an all-timer to just even push it to overtime. as great as James
I'll
Pollard
push back
was.
because I feel like DC got some pretty all-time performances on their end. I mean,
Sure. I mean,
Tyler Monroe
Cole
and
Jurek
Rowan
actually had the
McDonald.
highest plus minus in this game, by the way. Like we talk about James Pollard, Cole Jurek was +9 on the day.
Cole Jurek played out of his mind in this game. He played 30 total points.
Yeah.
He spent 14 on offense, 16 on defense. He was tasked with trying to stop Pollard a little bit. Had some efficacy, but like you really couldn't stop runaway James in this game. But
No.
to your point, I mean, Jurek had 2 assists, 6 goals, 2 blocks, both of which were layouts. 404 total yards, 26 to 27 from the field. But I mean, elsewhere, I mean, Tyler Monroe and Rowan McDonald don't have a turnover between them. Sorry, Monroe had 1 drop. They had no throwaways and almost 900 total yards between the two of them. Monroe had 5 assists, 1 goal, the goal being the game winner. Andrew Roy, he had 3 throwaways, which I need to go back and look the last time he had that many in a game. But he was still 63 of 66 on the night and had over 500 passing yards, completed 95% of his throws. And then I feel like the true sort of player that we're watched step into their own is the rookie, Elliot Bonet, who we were really hyped coming into the season. He showed a lot in his first 3 games with this team. This was his coming out performance. I mean, his ability to pick spots, know where to be in the system just 4 games into his professional career in a machine that requires so much timing like the Breeze offense, I think speaks really highly to his aptitude as a player. I mean, this is a young kid. He is just stepping into his abilities, and he looks absolutely suited for the moment. I mean, when he took that huck look to Monroe in the double overtime, there was zero hesitation. He saw his receiver streaking deep, and he ended the game. And it's that decisiveness. I mentioned something on Twitter about nobody can replace Boxley in this offense. Nobody can, right? Like, he's one of the best players in the world right now. But man, if you were going to find another player who can get separation, know their role, just play smart all of the time as kind of a simulacrum, a replacement for a Boxley, Bonet is about as good as you could find. You know, he finishes this game with 4 assists, 4 goals, 714 total yards, 34-36 from the field. That's pretty Boxleyan as far as efficiency and just working within the system.
He actually did if anyone wants to listen to him, just listen to him talk about Ultimate. He did do an interview with on the Tobu Fitness podcast that I listened to because I was like curious. I was like, oh, this guy's been new to the league. He's been doing pretty well. This was a great game from him. It was great listening to his thoughts too. He's very mature for such a young player. Like just the way he thinks about the game, he thinks about it in a very mature way, and I think it shows. As you said, in the way he's playing on the field, like things seem pretty fluid for him. You know, we've talked about some other teams, and we'll get to Boston later, who doesn't look super fluid on offense. But it seems like Bonet just kind of steps in and just it's like he's been there for years. On the flip side, like Bonet coming up in like a big moment, making the right throw at the right time and no hesitation. I think we saw the opposite happen with Philly. Let's just call it what it was. It was a collapse. It was an end of the game collapse. They had multiple opportunities to put it away. Bad throws, bad drops. You mentioned the layout D from Lee. Well, that was also on a play where Chun Moy didn't run through the disc. Like if he just runs and meets that disc, Isaac Lee doesn't have a chance to get that D. It was like mental mistakes like that all from Philly, like all throughout the end of the game that really
They had a push pass turnover in the red zone on offense.
I mean, yeah, it's like it hits him right in the hands. You drop it. Like Sean Mott had some really questionable decisions and like execution errors at the end of the game. He had 5 throwaways. I mean, like you talk about like when's the last time Brandon Roy had 3 throwaways? Like Sean Mott's been the guy that like you could kind of count on. I felt like. To make the right throw, to make the right play at the end of games, and it was the complete opposite of that in this game where he was kind of falling apart at the end of the game. And when your guy who's supposed to be the stable presence for you is falling apart in the most crucial moments of the game, I mean, you got to wonder what that was doing for the rest of the team too. Like a guy who's been so good for them for so long, their all-star representative both years. We had the all-star game, and rightfully so. He's been a great player for there, but he really struggled in this one.
Yeah, he's an all-timer. And to your point, last year he was completing 96% of his throws. In this game, 5 throwaways, he was under 90%. It's just very unlike him in those kinds of spots. He's been such a primetime performer for Phoenix. And unfortunately, as good as everything looked for 3.5 quarters, they exit DC 0-3 and Breeze go up to 3-1. And I think from that, we've got to pivot over to the other 3-1 East Division team, the reigning champions, who are slowly, they don't look themselves. They completed 0 hucks on Friday night in Boston. Yep. No explosives. They got 6 the next night in Montreal, but Royale still struggling a little bit on some of their deep defense. But New York now 3-1. They get two goal victories on the road. Little bit grindy, little bit ugly, but they're here. They're winning games. No one in this league knows how to win games better than the Empire have over the past 5 years. And they're starting to show that a bit. They have only 31 total turnovers on the weekend. They get 14 breaks on 13 blocks. So they're not necessarily pressuring. Again, they were down John Randolph this past weekend, arguably their best defender. I think Antoine Davis might have also been out of the mix for them. I just did not see I'm sorry. He was for them on Friday, but he was pretty much a non-factor on Saturday for them. On the weekend in total, they were 6 of 13 on hucks, just 46%. But on the flip side, their small ball, their discipline, their ability to just move the disc is becoming a little bit more up to their speed. They were 27 of 32, 84% on red zone opportunities. They now sit 12th overall in offensive efficiency. They're 13th in break rate, and they're 5th in red zone. But they've got 3 wins. They're tied virtually at the top of the East Division standings.
Yep.
You got to kind of figure it's a win for them at this point, given the rockiness of the past 7 weeks for them. This is a team that I think, if they can play themselves into shape throughout this season and sort of cobble together a re-understanding of themselves, they're going to be dangerous at some point. I don't know if I call them that yet. And as impressive as the win in Boston was, it felt very much like a team that knows how to win in New York, putting down a team in Boston that is still trying to find itself and still trying to figure out its identity. I mean, Jeff Babbitt had basically a perfect night against his former team. He didn't have a turnover, 30-plus completions. 5 goals? And it couldn't move the needle for a Glory team that just couldn't figure out the edges of the reigning champs.
Shout out to Ethan Fortin and shout out to Jeff Holm.
You. Yeah.
Those two guys.
Great adjustments to offense.
Yeah, I mean, as big of a problem as it's kind of been all over the place, the biggest change obviously was just that the offense just was a shell of what we saw last year.
It still is. It still is.
It still is. But
it has no explosives. It's really weird to watch.
Yeah, and Ben Yacht put up all these stats on Friday night. Like, you go look, like, oh, this is like a typical Ben Yacht game when you look at like the goals, the assists. But when you go watch it, this is not the same Ben Yacht, big plus minus game that you're used to. This wasn't him beating a bunch of people deep, though I will say he had a really nice grab on a hammer that was like fading away from him with multiple defenders around. I think he actually caught it around like his shoulder. It wasn't like he went up and grabbed it over people, but it was nice to see him win a disc that was in the air with defenders nearby, because that's been a struggle. But it was a bunch of like small ball. But Ethan Fortin, I felt like, he came in, he's been a D-line guy for them for that whole streak, the 31 game win streak, a guy who was on their D-line. He came in and looked so natural in that backfield with Solomon Rushmeyer-Bailey. He completed all of his passes on Friday night. He was 96% on the weekend. And for a guy stepping in and playing offense for all of his points basically over the course of a couple games, and a guy who hasn't really been asked to do that before, I was really impressed by his ability to get in there. And also just like he provided a little bit of like kind of quickness, and like you look at Ethan Fortin and he's like not built like a guy you would expect to have like that kind of quick first step, but the quickness he was able to kind of make those easy resets available for Solomon Roosmeyer-Bailey or whoever had the disc, it kind of solved a lot of the problems we saw in that Atlanta game where it looked like they were just struggling so hard to move the disc, even in the backfield. You didn't see any of that this weekend with Ethan Fortin back there. He was so key to them just being able to maintain possession of the disc and change angles of attack. And I think he deserves a big shout out for that because, I mean, being put into a role he hasn't really been asked to perform before. And Jeff Holm upfield, I mean, he's been a D-line guy for them as well when he's not making appearances on dating shows on social media. And, he did a good job just kind of providing a release valve that we basically only saw Jack Williams doing in the first two games. But now he had somebody to help do that with him. It wasn't all on the shoulders of Jack to just kind of get open for these easy throws all the time. And you could just see the difference in the movement. You're right. No explosiveness, still completely different offense than last year. But the fact that they were just able to move the disc with more consistency and with a little bit more of a flow to it was a really good sign for a New York team that is still trying to find its footing and still trying to figure out what they're going to look like in 2024.
Yeah, and I think for as much as the offense still looks turgid and is kind of working through a stuffiness, a constipation of obviously tons of absences and new pieces, the defense is starting to look a little bit more toothy than it has the past couple of weeks. I think that was almost more of the surprise for me coming into the season. I think I expected New York to come down a level or three, given that they were going to be missing the past two MVPs in this league and two of the most game-changing athletes in Jeff Babbitt and Ryan Osgar. I mean, those two players reshape the field whenever they step onto it. And so you're never going to find replacements for them. And I think that Holm and Fortin, while not providing the exact star caliber sort of, again, field warping talents that Babbitt and Osgar provide, they give the missing parts that you were just talking about stretching field and having some sort of quickness in the handler set to just keep things moving. I mean, the last time we saw them against Atlanta in week 2, they were like falling over to catch reset passes. I mean, they were making simple swings look arduous. They were just out there tense, and there was less of that this week. Again, there wasn't explosiveness. They still can't seem to get anything beyond maybe a 30-yard gainer at a time right now, but they've at least settled into that rhythm a bit. But on defense, they allow just 31 total goals. They get 14 breaks in 2 games. They aren't flying around out there like they were last year and sort of putting a vice grip on teams in the same way that they constructed a 31-game win streak on. But Brownlee, Breton Tan, Ryan and Mike Dross. Well, Mike Dross wasn't active, but Ryan Dross was running around out there making big plays. Like, they can still come at you defensively and just make things difficult for almost any opposing offense. And I think that that's going to be a really key part to watching them sort of, again, regain their footing. I think after they got kind of sideswiped from that pretty decisive victory by the Hustle down in Atlanta.
I'm really interested to see offensively if they ever can like find that deep game. I'm not sure. I mean, they just don't still seem to have that explosiveness downfield, like you mentioned. And
yeah, they don't have an explosive receiver right now. I mean, Holm and Yacht are big. You know, I'll give that to them. They can run in space. They can threaten, but they're not the type of receivers right now that are going to stretch defenses in a way that keeps them honest. Obviously, defenses are going to be aware of whenever Ben Yacht starts to make a route deep. But it feels like they have more confidence in being able to throw a couple defenders down there and get a block. I mean, Sorry, it was on Jeff Babbitt that Breton Tang got the block. But there were other times where Chris Bartoli or Gus Haflin or somebody else just sort of were able to put a canopy over Yacht going deep and force him under. And it's just not something that we're used to seeing. I mean, the East Division Championship game last year, Ben Yacht could not be stopped from going deep. And it'll be interesting to see if he can kind of work back into that shape throughout the season. But right now, he doesn't have that ability to take the top off of defenses, and it's completely reformatted New York's ability to attack.
Yeah, the speed and explosiveness just doesn't look like it's there anymore. And, you know, sometimes that's how it happens. Sometimes when those things go, they go fast. They go in an off season. But it was reassuring at least to see that like he was able to kind of put more of a stamp on this game in other ways. Because in the first couple of games, it kind of looked like he was still trying to be Bignot from last year, and he just doesn't seem to have that in him right now. But he kind of adjusted, and he's like, okay, I'll be a different version of Bignot today. I'm still going to, I'll get open in shorter spaces. I'll make the right throw when I get the disc. And, speaking of throwing, you brought up Jeff Babbitt, the amount of throws he had and, no turnovers, and that's great and everything. But are you as tired as I am of seeing Jeff Babbitt complete 15 throws in the backfield? Like, this seems like, to your point, it just kind of seems like where we talked about the well-oiled machine of Salt Lake City, it kind of feels like somebody built a watch by grabbing whatever spare parts they had around. And instead of it having that smooth second hand going around, it's kind of like just kind of trying real hard to work its way around the clock. And it gets there eventually, but doesn't quite have the same smoothness as, one of those Swiss timepieces. I just sitting there asking why is this what's happening in their offense? They still haven't figured it out. And I feel like for the first couple games, sure, you're trying to work through and figure it out, but we're 5 games into the season now. This needs to get figured out.
We're 7 weeks from Jeff Babbitt signing with him, though, with Boston. I think we need to maybe pump the brakes on the expectations for this Boston team just a little bit, because here they sit 3-2. Their 2 losses are to DC and New York by a combined 3 goals.
Sure.
I think they're doing okay. And I hear your concerns around some of the conservatism of this Boston offense, particularly with their ability to spell Babbitt in the backfield. But it's such a new unit that is learning to play together, and that is so apparent to me every single time they take the field. I mean, I think I talked about it last weekend when we were recapping, but I'll talk about it again. It just feels like the Boston offense exists in sort of 2 to 3 separate pods, and they haven't figured out how to unify all of that. And I was talking to you in the pre-show about how, you look at Carolina, you look at Salt Lake, those are groups of 7 who know how to play together. Boston right now is figuring out how to play 2 to 3 at a time. You see the Carapella, Sadok, Babbitt unit sort of working together, especially in red zone, small ball opportunities. I think it makes sense. It's not super sexy, it's not super explosive, but they clearly have a chemistry. And then you kind of go over to what we talked about as the X factor, the Tanner Johnson Go, Tyler Chan part of their offense. And that also looks really appealing, but they only engage that maybe 2 to 3 times a game. And I just think with Boston, they're still, for lack of a better way to put it, figuring it out. And given how early we are in the season, and given that they're one of the few teams that's even played 5 games, I don't really want to lament them playing disciplined against defenses like New York and DC, where they're maybe not attacking in the ways that we would like to see aesthetically from a Jeff Babbitt, a Johnson Go. And you and I were talking in the pre-show about Tyler Chan and whether he could really take this Boston offense to another level. His speed and his ability to sort of break out and I think take advantage of the matchups that he's given could really be an X factor for them. But it's May 20th. Like we're still in the first third of this season. I guess I just wonder and push back a little on you.
Whoa. You say first third of the season. It's not the first third of their season. They're almost halfway done with their regular
No,
season.
I know, but it's 5 games in 4 weeks. It's again 7 weeks since they signed Babbitt. He wasn't even practicing with them until the first weekend in April. You know, like, I don't hate having Babbitt in the backfield, given that you know what it reminds me of? Bo Kittredge going back in the backfield. People, you know, historically love to slander Bo as not having throws and not always being a great decision maker. That dude completed 95% plus of his passes in his professional career. He won, 5 titles. He barely lost a playoff game. And New York, when they won their first undefeated season in 2019, would spell Bo in the backfield. And it's not because he's going to stretch the field or anything else, but the dude's been in so many big games and understands so many situational plays in Ultimate that he's simply going to make the right decision more than basically anybody else. And I see that in Babbitt. Like, it's not the preferred mode for him. I totally agree with you there. It's a little out of place. It's like seeing a monster truck park in a daycare lot or something to see Babbitt running around in the backfield and just sort of doing swings and resets. But who's going to dispossess him of the disc back there? Who's beating him in a foot race in small spaces and edging out his size? Nobody. And so I don't know. I don't hate it. I don't disagree with you. I just don't. I guess I don't feel the kind of apathy you do towards it.
That was a really great way to say that I'm right. Here's my issue. He's so non-threatening back there.
Yeah.
You're right. He is completing the passes. That's great if you want to do that. But the thing is, they're not getting anywhere. It's not like he's completing. It's not even like they're gaining yards, right? Like when he's in the backfield, they are largely stuck in place. They're not moving the disc forward really with any sort of consistency. When he's back there, it becomes swing to that offhander, swing back to Babbitt, swing to the offhander, swing back to Babbitt, and they're not moving the disc up. If they were making any forward progress, I would have less gripes about this. But this is where I feel like the throwers on the team, the people who are actually they're counting on, relying on to move that disc, they have to come push Babbitt out of the backfield. I feel like they're getting cycled out into the stack, and then they're just sitting there, not pushing back out. Like, those guys have to work their way back in. Like, do you think if I got into the handler space and Keenan Plough got upfield, do you think he was ever going to let me sit back there? No, he was going to get his butt back in the backfield and tell me to go run and catch goals, because that's what I'm good at. That's what I do, and that's what Jeff Babbitt does. Like, that's what he needs to be doing too. And whether it's him calling somebody back into the backfield or the throwers working their way back in and pushing Babbitt out, like, that's one of the issues, that they're just too comfortable just standing in place. And that clearly isn't working from them in terms of, like, yeah, are they keeping games close? Yeah, their defense has been really stout and they're doing okay there. But, like, Ben Sadok needs to come and push him out. And, like, Ben Sadok needs to, honestly, as high of a volume as he's at, he needs to complete more passes, like, and make better decisions sometimes too. Like, they just need to be moving forward, at least with some sort of consistency. And you talked about it. We talked about it on the pre-show. Tyler Chan, I mean, he seems to be a guy that needs to get more involved too. I feel like, he had 18, he had like 20 total touches, I think, in the game, including the goals he scored on Friday. I think he could be getting the disc so much more. Like, he is so quick. Like, the times when he comes in and does get an in cut, it feels like he's always open by like 5+ yards. And I would love to see him get more involved. And like you said, it's kind of like they have like these pods of players who seem to kind of play off of each other, and they haven't quite figured it all out as a team. But I'm sorry. I think 7 weeks and 5 games, I don't know how often that they're practicing. So I guess that's an unknown for me. But to me, that's enough time to become a smoother running offense than this. These guys have all played tons of...
It's not unsmooth, though. I mean, just to push back lightly, their starting 7 on offense is all completing above 94.5% on the season. It's not like they have some glaring part that is taking shots that they shouldn't. They're playing conservatively. They're struggling a little bit to put up points, But I don't think that that's necessarily a problem given where the meta is at right now in the league. Like, you want to win kind of on your defensive side. You want your offense to not make mistakes, and that's what they're doing.
The problem is that completion percentage number can be a little misleading when you're completing more passes, right? Like
Right.
if you're completing that many passes and you're not moving the disc, right? Let's take us for example. Like this is
You're leading the league in completion percentage.
This is an extreme example, right? But like I think it kind of pushes the point home. We are averaging more than 430 completions a game in our 2 games. Insane. By the way, I went and looked this up. The highest ever for a team in a season average was 311 per game. So we are on pace to shatter that. So yeah, we're completing like 97% of our passes, which sounds incredible. And then you look and we have like 18 turnovers, right? Because with more passes, you need to have an even higher completion percentage because otherwise you're still getting that number of turnovers, which is ultimately the number that really matters, right? So I think that's what we're seeing in Boston too. It's like, yeah, everyone's completing at a pretty high rate. Like that sounds great, but like when you're expending as much energy and spending as much time throwing as they are, like the number of turnovers are still there, right? So I don't know. It just puts so much more stress on you too. It wears on you more, right? Like you're gonna have tireder legs in the fourth quarter because all of your offensive possessions are lasting so long, and that can sometimes lead to mistakes down in crunch time, and you don't want that to be what's happening all year. They definitely have the talent to figure it out. To me, I feel like it should just look a little bit more like people are more defined in their roles. And I just don't want to see Babbitt completing 20 passes in the backfield every game because, yeah, he's going to complete it and no one's going to dispossess him of the disc. And if he needs to get open in a small space, he can do that as well as anybody with his quickness, speed, and just his frame. But, it's like you said, it's like seeing a monster truck in a daycare parking lot. It just looks out of place. And does it get the job done? Yeah, kind of. But it also
you can go A to B. You can do groceries with it.
But it's holding up the line for everyone else because it's taking up it's taking up the entire carpool lane plus the other 2 lanes. So it's just kind of in the way, not being used maybe to what it should be doing is going downfield and smashing people and running over everyone else and just being bigger and stronger and better at everything than everyone else down there in the receiving end, which we know he's capable of. He is the reigning MVP for a reason. So I hope they get it figured out. But they the good news is with all of these games they've had so early in the season, they will have more time should they choose to take it to get more practices in and to kind of work the kinks out. So there is the silver lining of that.
Bringing it back to Tyler Chan just for a second, as well as his cutting mate Simon Carapella, both of them are in the top 20 in receiving yards per game. And I feel like, to your point, both of them could almost kick it up another notch. I just feel like they're both playing at such an incredible level this year. It feels like, given the talent that the team has added, they're only going to see their stock increase.
Mm-hmm.
But moving on from the East Division slate, one more recap I wanted to get to. We don't have to spend a ton of time on this one because, man, it was an ugly game, but the result was so interesting. Pittsburgh getting a 16-15 win in Minnesota. Wind chill, honestly, looking like at parts of this game like they forgot how to play Ultimate. Like it was like some pathological spreading of the yips almost as far as how stuff was playing. I didn't get a formal count, but I would say anecdotally, Pittsburgh probably had 6 scores within 4 yards of the end zone of Minnesota turning the disc over, either on offense or defense, and Thunderbirds just getting a score. I mean, I think most emphatically it was the Charlie Vukovic Callahan where he just sort of stepped into the lane, jumped up and came down, and as he's coming down is just screaming emphatically. It was one of the most bizarre games to watch back on film. I, like you, wasn't necessarily paying the closest attention live. And it was kind of one of those things where I've seen so many times the upset alerts start to go off. Oh, it's second or third quarter. This is getting pretty close. And then, the team that is expected to win sort of pulls away, gets a series of breaks, whatever. I was expecting that in this game from Minnesota. That's not what happened at all. This Pittsburgh team absolutely fought tooth and nail for this win and totally deserves to walk away with the W because they took advantage of every scant opportunity that they could. Pete Zaccardi coming down with that contested goal near the end of regulation, I thought was one of the more underrated plays in Pittsburgh's franchise history, just as far as a momentum shifter and sort of almost from an unsurprising place. But as much as I want to give credit to Pittsburgh, what the hell, Wind Chill? Seriously, man. I mean, for a team that I've been trying to sort of elide as far as having this kind of variance to their game for a while now, because I think last year they sort of moved away from some of these performances, even though they had a 10-goal loss in Colorado. That was with a bunch of starters down last year. We can move on from that. This sort of performance, especially before they have to go on the road this Friday to Madison and face a 2-0 Radicals team that absolutely looks rejuvenated and is going to be playing way up in their home opener. I'm worried for the reigning division champs. They look out of sorts. Their rotations, I had no idea who to expect on the field on either offense or defense by the end of that game. It was a complete headspin as far as who they were putting where. And I think Minnesota has the potential to be versatile in running out different formations and making tweaks to their roster, but this just felt chaotic. This just felt like we're just throwing stuff at the wall and trying to figure out what it works.
They didn't even get a last second throw to try to tie either, because was it Max Shepard, I think, that knocked down the disc at the end of I can't remember.
The amount of miscues on simple miscommunication is something so unlike this Minnesota team. I struggle to even have words for it. I mean, I'm stuttering right now. It was just like to your point on that last throw, he just didn't see Shepard trailing up in the lane. It's the kind of mistake that you see at... I was watching D3 Nationals earlier today. That's a D3 Nationals turnover. Like, you're throwing a pass into the middle lane and you don't anticipate maybe there's a defender running up into that space. But that was emblematic of the other, 27 turnovers they had in this game? I mean... This is a home game. This is their home opener. My mother went to this game and texted me afterwards. She was concerned. She wondered if the team got food poisoning. She was so unused to seeing them like this. She's a big Wind Chill fan. Shout out to Laura Ruffner. But just to bring it up as far as this game made no sense, man.
This was a game, if you just go back and look at Pittsburgh traveling to Minnesota, Minnesota wins this game by double digits every year. And it just was Minnesota's down a few players, who cares? They've been down a few players every game this season, and it hasn't seemed to affect them too much. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm still laughing about all the things you said, but it's because it's all true. And it's also unbelievable that it all happened this way. And look, the rest of the division is cheering right now, right? Because Minnesota, they got the 1 seed last year and it wasn't really close. They beat us 2 times and we were the next closest team. And, home field advantage in the playoffs is important. Across every division, generally what you see is the team with home field advantage.
They didn't lose a home game last year.
They lost one. They lost the Chicago.
Sorry, they lost Chicago.
Which was also a weird one because Chicago was down last year.
Yeah, it was the weird weekend where Chicago looked frisky for a weekend. They won in Madison. They won in Minnesota. They were coming up, and then, yeah.
And then reality hit. Yeah, it was... But I
No,
mean, I guarantee.
Minnesota's
Here's the
been
thing.
one of the strongest home franchises the past several seasons. I think
Yeah.
there's no hesitation in saying that.
Even going back to before, like even when they were only getting the 2 or 3 seed in the playoffs, they always played really well at home. That was always it's always windy. They always have like these defensive schemes that the wind just amplifies. I put out a tweet after the game. I was like, somebody please explain to me what happened in the DC and Minnesota games. This doesn't make sense to me. And I got a tweet back immediately like, oh, James Pollard had 1,000 yards and like 10 scores. I was like, oh, well, that makes sense as to why they're in the game. And the tweet I got back about the Minnesota game was, it was really windy. And I'm like, was it really windy just for Minnesota? Did the wind just like stop when Pittsburgh had the disc? Like, that's not an excuse. Like the better team, like I get that there are conditions that can kind of make it hard for everybody, but like if you're the better team, you still come out and you still win those games. Like that's how it's supposed to work. And it just didn't. They somehow looked less comfortable in the wind despite playing it all the time. They couldn't field a pole. This is a team that has 2 of the best pullers in the league who last year, that's what we talked about with their defense. It was always set up with these amazing pulls from Cameron Lacey and Sam Berglund. And what did we see? We saw them not be able to field bladey poles. Like, shouldn't you be as good at this as anyone? Like, you should see this in practice all the time.
Defensive conversion, like their ability to just pressure you and fill up break numbers. They were 4 of 17 against Pittsburgh.
And this has been a Pittsburgh team that, like, in their first 2 games, they've looked like you could make an argument for the worst team in the league. Like,
I wouldn't quite go that far given what exists in the depths of this league, but especially defensively, they really struggled to move the disc when they would have break opportunities, and this Minnesota offense gifted them a handful on their goal line. Just turn it over in the goal line, pick it up, hand it off to somebody. There's our break score.
For reference, like the first game Pittsburgh played against Minnesota in Pittsburgh, like a home game, they had 0 breaks the whole game. They did not break Minnesota once. So it was unfathomable to me that this would happen. But here's the thing, like I guarantee Minnesota, they looked at their schedule before just like everyone else, and you kind of you start naturally as a player, you kind of start doing the mental calculations. Okay, which of these games are we like really needing to try to win? Which games do we feel like, you don't want to say a free win, but you feel like you could almost put it in pen that you're going to win that game? I guarantee Minnesota had this one in the darkest Sharpie that they could find. Like, oh, Pittsburgh at home, free win. Like, we own this game.
That's how they treated their lineups. That's how they treated their lineups through the end of the game. They were running rookies out there in their 3rd professional game for their 2nd and 3rd to last defensive points when they needed a stop. I mean, and it completely upends both of the schedules or I think outlooks, I should say, for these teams. I mean, Pittsburgh now gets one of their most arduous matchups as a W, and they face Detroit, Toronto, you guys, Chicago, Detroit. So they could come out pretty favorably. And then the flip side, Minnesota, they just finished the easy part of their schedule. Their next 5 games, at Minnesota this Friday, at Indianapolis, you guys, hosting Colorado, hosting Madison, and at Chicago, a matchup that has flummoxed them historically the past couple of seasons. So they've also got to host New York later this summer. Like, it's one of those things for a Minnesota team that had one of the more difficult schedules heading into 2024. This was a need win. This wasn't, to your point of you Sharpie it as like an expected win. I would shift it to you needed to win this game given how much your schedule is going to push on you at other points in this year.
This is going to be a game. I don't know what it's going to end up doing by the time we get to the last, the end of the schedule, but I guarantee this is going to come into play somehow, and they're going to look back on this and they're just going to be kicking themselves because I can't imagine, like you said, with their tough schedule, that this isn't going to somehow play a factor in where they end up at the end of the season. So I don't know. We'll see what ends up happening. season's still really young. They're only 3 games in. A lot of our division is very early. Our division has played the least amount of games of the divisions, I think, or maybe the South is there with us, but we just, we're at 2 games. They're only at 3. Madison's only at 2, so there's a lot of games left in our division to be played, but
It's a long season.
Yeah,
It's a long season. I mean, I think that's one of the things to really take for a moment at this point after 4 weeks of play is that, yes, there's a lot of knowns. Yes, Salt Lake looks good. Carolina looks impressive. DC and New York are on top in the East. But as we've seen in these first, couple dozen of games, we have no idea what's going to happen in 2024. This is a season of chaos to me. Like, we're just dipping our toes as far as unexpected results and maybe a few topsy-turvy standings predicaments. I mean, even heading into this weekend, the standings just looked bizarre. And coming out of it, they look pretty bizarre. I mean, if you look at the West Division, you've got Salt Lake, Oakland, and San Diego right now as the prohibitive third seed in the West Division. And I don't know that will hold, but I want to segue into just very early playoff picture. I mean, Again, we're almost at the third way point of the entire regular season. There's 13 total weeks. We just passed 4. So I believe technically, like if we were counting days, we would be right at the third way point, right at 33%. So I wanted to kind of give a rundown of where we're at in the standings. In the West, every team but Salt Lake and Colorado have 2 losses. And with Salt Lake getting one of their wins against the Summit, it really puts the Shred head and shoulders right now above their competition. But as we've seen basically every season in the West, we have no idea what to expect from that division on the back half of that schedule. I mean, this point last season, would you have been talking about Oakland? No. Would you have been talking about LA? No. So we've still got a lot of calendar to chug through there. Central, Madison's on top again. Now, they've played Pittsburgh and Detroit so far. So little bit jury out as far as what those results mean. But with the Thunderbirds claiming a victory over Minnesota, gives a little bit more of a significance to that one. We'll see how they handle Friday night. But you guys lose one to Atlanta. You're going to be charging hard. Minnesota loses one. Chicago loses one. We've talked about it every single year, the melee of the Central Division and how there's seemingly almost a new divisional champ every season now. Since 2018, there's been 4 different divisional champs, more than any other division in this league. So just a lot of parity there. In the East Division, we've got somehow at this point the sort of chalky predictions that we headed into the season with New York, DC, and Boston as the 3 top seeds. But that figures to be jumbled in some order, and I can't quite figure out what it is now. Both New York and DC still play each other twice. Boston and New York have another game. DC and Boston have another game. Philly's going to be a monkey wrench somewhere in the season. You can just feel it after that performance against DC. And then the South, if you were to just take the standings right now, Houston would technically be the 3rd seed because they're 2-1.
Yeah.
But that doesn't figure to hold. Carolina and Austin both sit at 2-0. We kind of know how the South is going to turn out. What I want to ask you is, what are the teams that you're sort of looking at in these standings as being able to be movers, as being able to be a team that's able to make themselves relevant come the postseason?
I think you mentioned one of them. Madison is a team that I'm definitely looking really closely at right now. I think coming into the year, most people just thought it would be the same 3 teams as last year, the same 3 teams as the year before. It was going to be Minnesota, Indy, and Chicago. Madison has come down, looked really good. Like, you can only play who's in front of you, right? You can only play who's on your schedule. But in both games, they've looked dominant, which is what you would want to see if you're playing teams that you feel like you have the edge over. This Friday, I think, is going to tell us a lot about both Minnesota and Madison. I think Minnesota is going to be getting a lot of those guys who have been missing games recently are going to be back, I would expect. Will Brandt just finished winning a D3 national title. Congrats to Will Brandt. For my money, the most important person on their offense is going to be Will Brandt. He hasn't been there yet, so I'm guessing he's probably going to make his debut this week in Madison. I don't know that for sure, but it would make sense with his college season coming to a close. I would expect Dylan DeClerc to be back as well. I don't know about Sam Berglund. He had the injury at the Chicago game, but I think that'll be a really good litmus test for both Minnesota and for Madison in this game for us to kind of see what's going to happen going forward. Because, if Minnesota loses this game, I mean, that takes them down. That would take them down to what, 2-2? Yep. And they'd have 2 losses in the division. I mean, that's just like, could you imagine saying that coming into the season at this point? That's where they would be. It feels very, very weird after how good they looked last year. And that would put Madison up at 3-0 and all 3 of those wins coming in the division. I mean, that's setting yourself up like kind of the inverse of what we saw last year from Madison, where they started off so slow, even though they had some of these close games, and really they finished strong last year. Actually had, outside of New York, the longest active winning streak coming
5
into
straight
season.
for Madison.
So I don't know, like, Madison's kind of the team to watch. Chicago, we've only seen twice. The offense looked a little disjointed in that Minnesota game, though the defense still kind of looks like it's there and causing issues. But we've only seen a couple of games out of them, so we don't really know what to expect there either. That's who we play next. So, like, I guess we'll find out in a couple of weeks, which by the way, we've only played 2 games. We have another bye week this week, so we're just going to continue to not play games here in Indianapolis. But it is Indy 500 weekend, and if for anyone who knows anything about the Indy 500, like, it would just be really stupid of us to try to play in a game on Indy 500 weekend. So we pretty much always have this weekend off. But yeah, then we have a doubleheader. And you mentioned scheduling, man. I know I'm kind of all over the place with this right now, but like Pittsburgh, their schedule's favorable. We have to go. Both times we play them are in Pittsburgh. It's both times on the back day of the second day of a back-to-back. There's some weird things going on in the Central. I think it's by far, I think, it's gonna be kind of like the West. The Central and the West are gonna be this jumble of teams. Like, who's gonna come out of the melee on top? I think right now all bets are off everywhere. The only safe thing I think you can say is that Salt Lake is clearly head and shoulders above everyone else in the West, but everything else looks really up in the air in both divisions.
Well, we are barreling towards Memorial Day weekend. Again, as we mentioned throughout this podcast, there is a big next Super Series matchup in Madison between the Wind Chill and the Radicals this Friday. I am actually super stoked because that's where I live, and I get to experience live Ultimate for the first time in this 2024 UFA season, which is always when I feel like my season starts. Last couple of years in Madison, it's unfortunately been a few weeks into the season, so this is really my kickoff. I can't. Are
you on the call?
For this. What?
Are you going to be on the call?
So I think I'm actually going to be the sideline reporter this weekend, which
okay.
I'm really enthused about. I want to crawl into the stands and get some thoughts from diehard fans.
Yes.
You know, I think we always get the takes of how a player feels about a game, and you'll get a very measured response about how their teammates are performing and what we need to do better. I want to know what Madison Radical fan, 2 beers deep, couple rows in, feels about the team at halftime. I feel like that's the perspective that people are really yearning for. And Let Blue push back on me earlier today when I suggested it, but we'll see. I might find myself up in the stands at Breeze Stevens trying to get a little bit more of the takes from the hoi polloi and what they feel about that game, because I know they're going to be really interested. I feel like it's going to be pretty tilted atmosphere this weekend. We're hosting D1 College Nationals in Madison this weekend. It's going to be a big weekend in the capital city Ultimate, and that's only here. I mean, week 5 is, again, kind of like week 4, one that is just loaded with matchups. I mean, you've got Philly at New York, which is, again, a matchup that Phoenix always play up for. We mentioned Minnesota at Madison. Chicago is going to their Texas road trip, which is one of the more under-talked about scheduling quirks of this entire season. They're at Houston on Friday before facing the Soul on Saturday in the game of the week. Pittsburgh at Toronto. Pittsburgh pick up their second win of the season. Toronto looking a little out of sorts. week 5 just figures to be continuing on another hot streak of really intensifying matchups as we work into the 2024 regular season. But that'll do it here and now for this episode of Swing Pass as we recap week 4. We will be back with you in just a couple days to preview week 5. Cam and I will bid you adieu for now, though. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.